Thank you, everyone. So we're going into our last talk for this category. It's going to be presented by Zarah Deutsch. She has already achieved getting her DVM, and now she's a graduate student at the University of California, Davies, and she's going to be talking about salmon welfare.
Hi, thank you so much for that introduction. I'm very excited to talk to you guys today about the various behavioral methods that are used to assess welfare in salmonids. First, for those of you who are potentially less familiar with aquaculture, I wanted to do a brief summary of what aquaculture really is, which is really any breeding, rearing, or harvesting of fish or any other aquatic organisms. Global aquaculture is becoming increasingly important. Right now, we are farming more fish than we're catching globally. As of 2019, it was an estimated 120 billion fish slaughtered for food versus the approximately 80 billion combined birds and mammals. Obviously, a lot of individuals are affected by these practices. I'm interested in salmonids because they're one of the top most commonly farmed fish in the top 5, and they're generally considered one of the most economically valuable. There's also comparatively more research on salmonids than on other top farmed fish species. And in addition to being found commonly in aquaculture, they're also found in a lot of hatcheries and a lot of laboratories as well. My personal definition of animal welfare tends to focus fairly heavily on the affective state. Obviously, there's a lot of components that can contribute to affective state. And what I mean by affective state is an internal state that has valence, either positive or negative, pleasant or unpleasant. However, when I was reading through a lot of this literature on salmonids, I didn't find that there was a lot of definitions that necessarily were consistent with that, or papers that even defined their definitions for that matter. So I found that there was a lot of different disciplines that have their own definitions of welfare or use it in their own way, and that the measures of the way people are measuring welfare can also vary, and historically have tended to focus a lot on primarily negative experiences. And so this led us to our research question, which was, what are the outcome measurements that have been used to assess the welfare of cultured salmonid populations? So in order to pursue this research question, we decided to conduct a scoping review with the following aims, which were to perform a descriptive analysis of the literature, describe the global scope of this research, and then highlight the outcome measures and discuss their utility. We were looking only for English language articles from peer-reviewed journals that were primary research topics, and focusing on salmonids in cultured settings only. We also wanted to find articles that only had the word welfare or well-being and linked it to one of the outcomes that they were actually measuring. We wanted articles published between 1981 and 2022, which was the most recent year included in our search. I recruited 3 undergraduate research assistants for this project, trained them on 100 articles for our first level screening and 15 articles for our level 2 screening. And then we screened all the articles in parallel, and any disagreements were arbitrated by one of the 3rd independent undergrad reviewers. After we conducted our initial search, which consisted of various terms referring to different types of salmon and also the words welfare or well-being, we had recruited 2,533 unique articles from our search, and we conducted our level 1 screening, which consisted of just the title and abstract to make sure that the articles were in English, covered the appropriate species, and that they were under captive management somehow. I didn't want any wild animals in the study. After level 1 screening, we narrowed it down to just over 1,000 articles for our full text screening, where we're making sure that it was either an experimental or an analytical observational study, and that somewhere in their paper, they linked one of their measured outcomes to either welfare or well-being. After our level 2 screening, we narrowed it down to 228 articles, and we performed data extraction over 20 different components, including demographics, various interventions and outcomes. And then we also pulled out what their explicit welfare association was, which of their outcomes they measured and associated with welfare, and then performed a descriptive analysis. What we found is that Norway is doing this research. It's pretty much just Norway. I made this really fun color graph, which you can't see the numbers on. But the reason that Norway is in black is because Norway produced 102 articles in that time frame. And then the next top 3 countries were the the UK, Denmark, and the US respectively, with 18, 16, and 10. So my color grading is a little skewed. We also found that, consistent with commercial practice, most of the articles involved Atlantic salmon or rainbow trout, but we did see a really big variation in the size of the animals, from under a gram to nearly 10 kilograms. And we found that most of the articles were conducted in these land-based aquaculture facilities. So flow-through and recirculating systems are generally on land. And we didn't find as many articles that were in marine aquaculture systems, which would be the sea cages and the net pens, as you can see in this graph. Finally, and most interestingly, the outcomes that we associated with welfare in the studies, we categorized into 5 major categories, which were health, behavior, production, resources, and development. Just for the sake of time, we're going to talk mostly about health and behavior in this talk. So our physiological health and functioning category was understandably very broad and included tests from CDCs to necropsy-based tests, organ function tests, genetic and immune markers, proteomic tests, and all these tests were in some way or shape associated with welfare by the authors. But our more common tests were things like fin damage, which was fairly commonly used. We also saw a number of articles that were using cortisol, and then we had some articles doing external lesion assessments like this or like this, and also some eye damage and some skeletal health assessments. Behavioral assessments, for those of you not familiar with aquaculture, can sometimes be challenging for a number of reasons. First of all, some of our environments are very remote or very high density. Sometimes there's a lot of difficulty seeing the fish in some dark or turbid waters. There's also a lack of research on highly motivated behaviors in these species. And there's a lot of differences even within the salmonid groups between species and in life stages. Having said all that, there was some consistency with our behavioral assessments. Generally, we had a number of them using some sort of like swimming pattern assessment to make claims about welfare. Fewer articles were looking at aggression, but then there was a lot of other sort of sporadic or individual papers that were looking at specific behaviors, such as avoidance behavior, stereotypies, or anticipatory behaviors, and then also some tests looking at preference testing, judgment bias testing, or social network analysis, a lot of variety overall. For swimming and dispersion, since that was our most common behavioral grouping of tests, this included both individual measures of swimming, such as swimming velocity or swimming pattern done by an individual, and also group measures, which included dispersion and cohesion. Some of these were assessed manually, and some of them, like from this article, were assessed through computer statistics or AI, and are assessing sort of how the groups are moving together and how the group is functioning. Aggression is measured a number of ways from various articles, either through direct behavioral observations, either live or from video, through social network analysis, or like can be seen in these images. Sometimes they're measuring aggression through these proxy indicators of damage, as it has been shown that specific fins are often the target for aggressive interactions in fish, and sometimes those can covary pretty well. Obviously, there's advantages and disadvantages when you're trying to measure welfare with any of these outcomes. For our health and physiology category, some of the advantages for measuring welfare or effective state is that poor health likely does impact animal welfare. And then some of the measures that we saw, the more common ones like fin damage or other types of external lesions, are very practical to use. You don't need a lot of additional training. You don't need expensive testing. However, good health does not always equate to good welfare. There are certainly situations where you can have an animal in good health and have a poor effective state. And then some of the other tests that we saw in that category can be potentially invasive, and especially in aquaculture situations can be either logistically or financially challenging or both. For our behavioral tests, the advantages are that there are some exciting new technological options for both collecting data in some of our challenging or remote aquaculture situations, and also for interpreting data through the use of things like AI or other remote sensors. And then some of the behavioral tests in some species, including fish, can be a more direct expression of affect than, for example, our health or physiology tests. However, as mentioned, there are certainly environmental limitations that are specific to fish or other aquatic species. And in this grouping of species and in other aquaculture species, there's definitely a lack of research on the highly motivated behaviors or natural behaviors that we would want to look for. So overall, what we found, most commonly, we saw physiological health and functioning outcomes. These were being used to justify any sort of claim or argument that the authors were trying to make about welfare. And between health and behavioral outcomes, we really didn't see like one consistent measure. There was a lot of variety represented. And that overall, there wasn't really a common definition of welfare. No one really defined welfare in their papers, but there wasn't like one go-to technique or one go-to measure that anyone was using to measure welfare for these species. We did only look for English articles because unfortunately I only speak English, which could certainly limit the types of articles that we were able to include. I'm sure there are relevant articles from other languages that I wasn't able to find. And then we chose not to use gray literature because we weren't able to distinguish between gray literature that went on to be published versus that didn't. And so we didn't want to have any duplication, but we understand that may have introduced publication bias into our results. Next steps, I hope that more research is done to continue to validate welfare indicators for these and other aquatic species. And also that there's specifically more research for trying to assess welfare in large-scale production systems, including things like automated behavioral assessments, which I think has a lot of promise. And with that, I'd really like to thank all of my undergraduate research assistants, my lab, the Animal Welfare Epidemiology Lab, the UC Davis librarians were really helpful in creating my search criteria, and the UC Davis Center for Animal Welfare, and I would be happy to take any questions.